Hey everyone, this is Damon with Low Budget Late Model, here with another installment of Parts of a Race Car. Today we're going to talk about the rear end of a dirt late model. Specifically, we're going to talk about the quick change rear end that dirt late models utilize. We're going to talk about why they use a quick change rear end, what that means, and how it can be used as a tuning tool. And that's what we're going to do today. So let's get started. Before we get started, big shout out to Integrity Aquatic, my current main sponsor. If you are a company that has any kind of underwater needs, any type of underwater contracting needs, be it construction, demolition, welding, you name it. If you need something done underwater, these guys are the guys to contact. So integrityaquatic.com. Appreciate their help, and there you go. So before we get started on a quick change rear end, let's talk about the rear end or the differential of a normal vehicle, say my Camaro or the truck I have outside. These utilize rear wheel drive vehicles like this, use a standard rear end with a standard ring and pinion gear, ranging in gear ratio ranges of 3-to-1 to 4-to-1. Now, what the heck does that mean? That means that every time the drive shaft turns 3 times, if it's a 3-to-1 ratio, the tire will rotate 1 time. In essence, a ring and pinion, a gear ratio, is designed as torque multiplication. It's essentially taking the power of the engine and increasing its overall amount of torque to give you more power at the rear wheels. Now, the disadvantage to this is the steeper the gear ratio, the numerically higher gear that you have, the higher RPM you're going to have when you're rolling down the street. So for instance, in my Camaro here, I have a 308-to-1 gear ratio. That means when I'm in 4th gear in my 4-speed transmission, which is a 1-to-1 ratio in the transmission, that means that every time the drive shaft turns, that means that every time the drive shaft turns 3 times, the tire is going to rotate once. What that equates to is that when I'm rolling down the street at about 60 miles an hour, that engine's going to be going about 2,500 RPM, which isn't bad. Now, old school hot rodders that used to put a 411-to-1 gear in the back, you're running around on the highway at 60 miles an hour at like 3,000 RPM, which will suck down gas really fast. Now, there's lots of other factors that we can talk about here. The size of your tire is important. There are formulas that allow you to figure out what the RPM is going to be at, say, 60 miles an hour when you're cruising down the highway, given a particular size tire and the gear ratio in your rear end and the final gear ratio of your transmission. Most modern day vehicles, including the truck I have outside, utilize an overdrive transmission. It has a 6-speed overdrive transmission, which means that the last 2 gears are technically less than 1-to-1, which means that the gear ratio that the tire sees is going to be less than whatever the actual gear ratio is. So for instance, if you're rolling down the street and you have a 342-to-1 gear ratio in the back, and you have an overdrive transmission that takes you down to 0.5-to-1, that means that rear end is only doing like 1.7-to-1. That can really significantly help with the overall RPM that you're running at a given speed rolling down the highway, but then still also give you the acceleration when you're in 1st and 2nd gear. So it's relatively complicated, but that gives you the idea behind how a rear end works and why when you're going down the street, your engine might be doing 2,000 RPM as opposed to 1,500 RPM, which affects your gas mileage and all of that. So that's what a normal rear end is like. And here's what the inside of a rear end basically looks like. As you can see over here, we have where the drive shaft connects to the rear end. Inside of that is a pinion gear. The pinion gear is attached to a ring gear. These two things mesh together, and then the ring gear is bolted to some sort of what's called a differential. On the street, we talked about this in one other video. On the street, a lot of people tend to run like a open differential where only one wheel is actually getting power, or a limited slip differential where two wheels are getting power some of the time, but if you're going around a curve, one of the tires unlocks so that you aren't just chirping your tires as you're trying to go around a curve. So that differential is connected to your axles. The axles obviously go out towards the wheels and turn the wheels. So that's a standard rear end in a standard rear wheel drive application. Ring and pinion gear, differential, axles, wheels. Now, if you're just on the racetrack like a drag strip, or even what we run on circle track, inside of here is what's called a spool. That differential is just a solid piece of aluminum basically with spline that's splined so that your axles can connect to it. That's because we don't care. We want power going to both wheels at all times. So that's how that works. Now, let's talk about how it works in a dirt late model. So here we have underneath our dirt late model, up in the front there, you've got the engine. The engine's connected to the transmission. On a dirt late model, we run what's called a 2-speed transmission, usually through companies like Burt or Brin or Falcon. It's a 2-speed transmission. There's no clutches on the outside of that transmission like you have in a standard like 4-speed car. The clutches are inside the transmission and they're hydraulically activated. In low gear or first gear, the clutches are working and you can slip the transmission so that you can get the car rolling. But then once you get the car rolling fast enough, you can drop the car into high gear or second gear. Now in high gear, there are no clutches. It is what's called direct drive. That means that the power that's coming from the engine is going to get connected directly to that transmission with no clutches or anything in the middle to provide slippage or horsepower loss. It's a direct drive, direct link. So then out of the transmission, you're going to have your drive shaft. Drive shaft's going to spin. It's going to connect to the rear end back here at the yoke. And then it's going to connect, just like in what we talked about a minute ago, it's going to connect to the ring and pinion inside of the pumpkin, inside of the rear end. The pinion gear is going to be connected to the ring gear. The ring gear is going to be bolted to a spool. The spool is going to be connected to the axles. The axles are going to come out here, and they're splined on both ends. On the other end, they're going to attach to this drive plate. If I took this drive plate off, you would see on the inside of it, there are splines that will hook on to the splines of the axle. So when this is all bolted together, that's what's going to make the wheels turn. So there you go. Now, what's different about a dirt late model? Well, in a dirt late model, we use what's called a quick change rear end. It has some extra stuff on the back. That extra stuff causes you to have the ability to change your gear ratio quickly. That's why it's called a quick change rear end. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this the back cover off of this so you see what the inside of that quick change rear end looks like. Take a look at what a pair of quick change gears looks like, and then we can talk about how we use that to tune our dirt late model. So I've taken the cover off of the rear end where you access the quick change gears. And here you can see the 2 additional gears that are attached with splined shafts to the ring and pinion gears that are inside the pumpkin. As you can see, you have a bigger gear on top and a smaller gear on the bottom in our case. As you can see, as I rotate the wheels, you can see those gears activating and turning. Here is the inside of the cover once we take that off. As you can see, there's 2 bearings in there that these shafts will ride on to make sure everything stays nice and smooth and keep everything together. So now that I've shown you that, we're going to take those 2 gears out of here and we're going to show you what everything means and how we use it to tune the race car. So here we pulled the gears out of the rear end, which is simple. They literally just pull out right off the splines. Nothing difficult there. Again, the idea is to make this quick, to make gear changes fast, to make it easy to change your gear. So you might be wondering, well, what the heck do these do? Quick change gears, this set of gears here, change the overall gear ratio of your rear end. Now, the rear end itself, the ring and pinion gear, in our case, have a 486-to-1 gear ratio. There are two main gear ratios available in quick change rear ends, 486 and 411. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. A lot of the newer guys run a 411. We still run a 486 rear end, which is fine. The quick change gears allow you to change that gear ratio. So how the heck does it do that? Well, first, there's a chart. I have the chart over here. The chart, as you can see, has a whole bunch of different numbers on it. The first number on the left is what's called the gear set number. On our gears, on a Winner's Performance gear, that number is right there. In this case, it's number 11. It's after the 85. It's number 11. So what you would do is you would go over to your chart and you would find set 11. Oh, there it is. If you look at set 11, it tells you the number of teeth that are on each gear. There's 22 on the small gear and 27 on the big gear. If you were to count the number of teeth on each gear on the gears that we have laying on the shelf here, you would find that the top gear, the bigger gear, has 27 and the smaller gear has 22. Now, what you do next is you look up at the top to find which ring and pinion you have. 411, 457, or 486. That's what we have. Now, there are two options. There's low and there's high. High means that the bigger gear is on top. Low means the smaller gear is on top. If they're arranged in those fashions, you'll yield the gear ratio that you see on this chart. So going back to what we talked about, this is set number 11. So we found set number 11 on the list. We went across. We need to go all the way over to the last column, and we need the high, because we're going to put the bigger gear on top. As you can see, that means that your overall final gear ratio in that scenario will be 596-to-1. So let's say you don't know what the number on your gear is. Let's say it's rubbed off or something of that nature. Well, you can figure out what your gear ratio is going to be by doing math. First, you're going to count the number of teeth on the top gear. In our case, it's 27. You're going to count the number of teeth on the bottom gear. In our case, it's 22. You're going to divide those two numbers together. So you're going to do 27 divided by 22. And in our case, you're going to get 1.227 and on and on and on. You're going to take that number and you're going to multiply it by the ring and pinion gear ratio that's in the rear end. In our case, it's 486. So let's multiply. Times 486. And what do you know? You get 596 and change. So that gives you a sense of how to calculate that gear ratio. Now, what does that do? Well, when we talked about a regular car, we know that the final gear ratio determines the RPM that you run at a given speed, 60 miles an hour, whatever, based on your tire size and such. In our case, what we can do with this quick change rear end is we can change the time at which our engine peaks RPM when you're going down the track. Now, there's varying theories on this. Some people say that you should have your engine hit peak RPM when you're crossing the start-finish line. Some people say it should be a little after, right before the let-off point, right before you let off to enter the corner. In either case, you want to make sure that your gear ratio matches that. Now, track conditions have a lot to do with that as well. First, we're going to change gear ratios depending on the track size. The bigger track we run at, Wayne County Speedway, it's a big 3/8 mile track. In general, the gear ratio that you saw there, 596, is a decent gear ratio for that track. Some guys sometimes will run around a 579, 580, up to about a 596. When you get to a slightly smaller track, like Erie's Speedway that we run at over in PA, it's really about a third of a mile track. It's a little bit smaller. In that case, we tend to look for a gear that's in the low sixes, 623, 632, something of that nature. If you're on a big track like Pennsylvania Motor Speedway or Eldora or one of those tracks, you might get as low as the low fives, 520, 530. I've even seen guys run in the high fours, 486. Just all depends. And again, the track conditions will determine also what gear ratio you decide to run. Changing your gear ratio by a tenth of a point or so, from 623 to 632, can make a difference in entry and exit of your corner depending on the track conditions. If the track's heavy, you might need a given gear ratio to get you off the corner a little faster. If the track's real slick, you might need to change it depending on that. All of these are tuning features that allow you to try to gain the most traction possible and achieve the best RPM possible as you're going down the track and going into and out of the corners. In addition, different gear ratios will change your deceleration as well. A steeper gear ratio will mean that when you let off the gas, that engine's going to wind down a little bit different, which will change how quickly you decelerate when you're going into a corner. All of these factors come into play when you're trying to tune a race car for a given track and a given set of track conditions. So that gives you an idea how quick change rear end works. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Again, thank you to Integrity Aquatic for your help. And there you go.